My name is Ruben Hernandez Leon. I'm a professor of sociology and director of the Latin American Institute at UCLA. And I want to welcome all of you to our series, Migrant Children Negotiating Educational Systems. This is part of our outreach program at the LAI, at the Latin American Institute, a program that is coordinated by Veronica Zavala. This is a year-long series that we're getting started today with the talk by Professor Ted Hamann. Veronica will introduce him in just a moment. But this series actually focuses on the experiences of migrant children who study and participate in different national education systems as they cross borders. We will have a presentation once a month by distinguished scholars located in different countries. And we want to encourage you to stay tuned and to register for and participate in these events. So one presentation on this series once a month for the rest of the academic year. Before I turn it to Veronica, again, she will introduce our speaker today. I want to encourage you to donate to the outreach program of the LAI. I think of this program as a gem, actually, within the activities conducted at the LAI, because this is a program intended to connect with school teachers, community college educators, and others. And this is one of the ways in which the LAI, the Latin American Institute at UCLA, impacts our community. Many initiatives in schools actually result from teachers participating in the courses, the workshops, the seminars organized through the outreach program of the LAI. Veronica Zavala will be posting the link in case you are interested in donating. And just in case you have some, rich cousin, you might be related to Bill Gates or somebody else who might just, become, very, very enthusiastic with these endeavors here, right? So without further ado, welcome all. And I want to turn it to Veronica, who will introduce Professor Ted Hamann, our speaker, our inaugural speaker for this series today. Veronica, take it away.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Ruben Hernandez, for such an welcoming introduction of the series. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And my name is Veronica Zavala, as I was mentioned, and I coordinate the K-12 outreach program. And if this is your first event attending within the outreach, part of our mission is to be able to take the resources, and especially the research focus on Latin American and K-12, and diffuse it to educators, to scholars and a larger community, with the purpose of being able to disseminate this research into improvement in the K-12 and be able to incorporate this content into the classrooms. And we are very, very excited for this series because it's been something that has been in the works for a while now, and it's so nice to finally everything is coming together, and we're really pleased to be able to collaborate with a range of scholars. And today will be our first one, as Dr. Hernandez mentioned, and we'll be having one on a monthly basis. So keep tuned for the next one coming up in November. So our first speaker, Ted Hadman, he is a professor of education and policy and practice in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Teacher Education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he's been since 2005. He's trained as an anthropologist of education and the outgoing president of the American Anthropologists Association Council of Anthropology and Education. He has authored more than 80 journals and book chapters, as well as more than 12 books, special journal issues, and monographs. And today he's going to be sharing part of his research that dates back to the 1990s when he was a doctoral student at University of Pennsylvania. The title of his presentation is How Enduring Student Nationalism Changes the Roles of Teachers. And we will be having a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to write your questions in that chat box, and we will be going over them at the end of the session. Please help me welcome Dr. Ted Hamann. Bienvenido, profesor.
Pues muchísimas gracias. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. At my end, I feel tempted to say good evening to you. I am reaching out to you from Lincoln, Nebraska, where night has just fallen because it's October and days are getting shorter. I do want to make a brief clarifying note why it is true that the origin of this research can find roots in the 1990s. It's also true that it's ongoing. And so it's kind of a career sweep that I'm going to try to be attending to and all quite quickly. So I thank you for coming along on the adventure. Please, I've got my own pen here for note taking, but please take notes. There is an intentional Q&A session at the end. At this point, what I see on my screen are just the sort of four, myself plus three coordinators. And so I won't see a signal if somebody is sort of hoping to ask a question, for example, until we switch over to Q&A. But do take notes because we're going to be jumping through a lot. And I suspect at different points, if I risk losing you, I obviously want to sort of get you back so your questions will matter. Allow me to start with some acknowledgements. The first is obviously to the Latin American Institute for the invitation, and in particular to Ruben Hernandez-Leon. I actually first met Ruben when I was a doctoral student. This takes us back to the 1990s. And the reason I'm bringing this part of the story up is it's germane to the research that we will present. I was an ethnographer taking notes on a binational collaboration that involved two school districts in Georgia, which were rapidly becoming majority Latino after having a predominantly white, Appalachian white, and a much smaller African-American population for most of their histories. And so it was this sort of weird scenario of the ethnographer taking notes on the sociology doctoral student who was wearing a different hat as the associate of a research project that brought in the Universidad de Monterrey in Mexico. I will refer back to that, but in one sense, this is a continuation of 25 years of learning from him and with him. I also want to say thank you to Victor Zuniga and Juan Sanchez Garcia. Victor goes back to those days in Georgia, but he and I have continued to collaborate for the last 25 years. And in particular, Victor and Juan and I have done a lot of thinking about students in Mexico who've previously been in the US, and students in the US who've previously been in Mexico. And Victor, in fact, has coined the turn of phrase 0.5 generation, where as a sort of play on 1.5 generation, where that references kids who move, who immigrate as children, and sort of the idea is their childhood, their first gen, but their childhood is in the arrival country. And 0.5 suggests that maybe it's even more complicated than that. There's movement, but it's not terribly clear which is the starting point and which is the destination. I also want to offer a quick thank you to Maestra Yara Amparo Lopez, who I've worked with for 15 years in the Secretariat de Educación Estatal in Baja California, and Betsabe Roman, who has more recently joined the team with Victor and Juan. That all said, any flaws or limitations to this presentation, I need to own, they're mine. So knowing that I'm trying to consolidate an awful lot of stuff quite quickly, I thought it would be helpful to give you a thesis. I tell my undergraduates, you know, in a sentence or two, can you tell me what you're trying to argue and then spend the whole rest of your paper making the argument? This is my attempt to do that. So from both a biographic standpoint and one of trajectory, the persistent transnational movement of students and families between the United States and Mexico, and for that matter, between the United States and the Northern Triangle countries, means the mononational assumptions of schooling in the United States, Mexico, and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador all need to be reconsidered. What we teach, how we teach, and what languages we teach in are all prospectively in play. I realize that's a big and sweeping thesis. You may, by instinct, want to push back on that or say, I'm not quite sure what you mean, or I'm going to sort of wait and see if I'm convinced. But the task of the remainder of this presentation is to try to clarify why that's the conclusion that I've come up to at this point in my career. Mainly, I'm going to try to defend 5 assertions, and they are intentionally interdisciplinary. One comes from philosophy or human rights. And it's the claim that as I write, children deserve effective schooling. A second is going to come from social psychology and learning theory, borrow from Vygotsky and talk about constructivism. The third is going to come more from cultural anthropology than anything, and it's going to juxtapose turns of phrase, emic and edic, that may or may not be familiar to many of you. I will walk you through those. A fourth comes from sociology. It's an idea called transnationalism from below. I will also walk through that. And the fifth, but not last, it's actually intended to be the punchline, is from demography. And that's where we note that there's well over 1 million children who are in circulation between the school systems of the United States and Mexico. Some are currently in Mexico, having previously been in the United States. Some are currently in the United States, having previously been in Mexico, and more than a few have a biography that is more complicated than that. It's in Mexico, then the United States, then Mexico, and maybe again in the United States, that kind of thing. And so the premise that, you know, one country's school system should teach you how to live in that country, and that's the full and complete task, seems incomplete for people who are living and anticipating continue to live binational or transnational lives. But before I go there, before I walk through those 5 pieces, I want to give a little bit of a deep background. The origin of sort of the main part of the research that I want to talk about here came from a kind of serendipitous moment. Rubén Hernández León, who you heard from briefly in the introduction, Victor Zuniga, and 2 other researchers who were part of the Universidad de Monterrey research team back in 2000, studying in Northwest Georgia, noted that in a series of surveys with parents, that 75% of the parents, it was actually 74% of fathers, 72% of mothers, I think, or vice versa, but essentially 75% of parents were reasonably confident, and said so in surveys, that 3 years hence they would continue to be living in Northwest Georgia. And for purposes of that project, that information was proof that however new the Latinx community was in Northwest Georgia, it was quickly becoming a permanent community. And any kind of attempt by longer term residents there to sort of wish that this demographic transition might go away was misleading. In fact, the demographic change was permanent and prospectively exciting. That was the point that the Mexico-based research team wanted to make, that Rubén was part of. They were kind enough to share that data with me, and I asked a different question from it. I wondered where the 25% of parents who were confident that they wouldn't be there 3 years hence, where were they and their children going to go? And that raised up the question, well, maybe they were going to move to the big city, to Atlanta, where lots of jobs there, or maybe they were going to move to older locations where Mexican origin populations have long circulated in the United States, like Dallas or Houston or El Paso or Los Angeles, et cetera. Or maybe the return on the part of the parents, maybe movement on the part of the kids, depending on where children were born, would be to Mexico. And so from that point of origin, Victor Zuniga, who's a longtime collaborator actually with Rubén as well, Victor wrote a proposal to CONOCYT, the Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología, which is essentially Mexico's National Science Foundation, asking if we could, and successfully asking, we secured some funding, if we could do a study in the state of Nuevo León, which is where Monterrey is. So logistically, that was a very easy place to start a study. And then in Zacatecas, which historically is at a higher migration rate to the US, if in those 2 states, with the stratified random sample of schools, if we could look to see if there were any kids in Mexican schools who'd previously been in the US. We conjectured that there might be, but at that point it was a guess. Fast forward just a couple of years, in 2004, fall of 2004, having secured funding from CONOCYT, we decided that we would pilot some initial instrumentation, some site visit protocols, certain ideas. What would we want to find out if we found any children who, in fact, had previously lived in the US? And that first pilot study, wasn't full-fledged study at that point, led to a paper that came out in 2006 called Pensando en Cintia y su hermana, And then a subtitle of it was Y Rosa También. What that paper described, and what I want to sort of bring up to you, is that right from the word go, we found some students in Nuevo León, Mexico, which was our first research site. We found some kids who'd previously been in the US. We interviewed a young woman, girl, sixth grader, I guess girl probably fits for where she was at that time in her life. And she had originally, she'd been born in Mexico, at age 2 had moved to Oklahoma, and had done her schooling through 4th grade in Tulsa, Oklahoma. As a 5th grader, she had moved to Mexico, to the community we found her in as a 6th grader, so she'd moved 18 months earlier. She had been a successful student, liked school in the US, and had become a successful student and liked school in Mexico, and proudly told us, switching back and forth in English and Spanish, that she aspired to someday become a teacher of English. She wasn't sure if that would be in Mexico or in the US. But school was clearly good to her. She liked school. Negotiating 2 countries, perhaps it had been a challenge for her, but it was a challenge that she was succeeding at. But she also mentioned, as part of our interview, her sister, who was younger, and her sister's Spanish, for whatever reasons, and we can talk about family dynamics, we can talk about kids' different language acquisition skills, etc. But her sister, upon moving to Mexico, her sister had been born in the US and was a US citizen by birth because of that. Her sister, when she had moved to Mexico, had been held back, which meant that the sister who had done 3rd grade in the United States was placed again in 3rd grade in Mexico. And that reflected the fact that the Mexican school system then, and in this case, still now, doesn't have an easy mechanism for responding to a student whose Spanish proficiency is less than anticipated by age or grade level. And so, you know, there's the old expression that if your only tool's a hammer, every problem's a nail. If your only mechanism for the unexpected is to hold the kid back a year or 2, that's the strategy for welcoming a newcomer. Although, as we know from other research in schooling, grade level retention can be the beginning of all kinds of trajectories that lead to unsuccessful school outcomes, dropping out, or diminished aspirations, etc. So Cynthia, successful student, negotiating 2 countries. Her sister, not necessarily as successful, at least the cautionary note, and we should point out that at the time we did this interview, the sister was still in school. It's possible that that story turns out great, but there were some more worrying signs. Also from the fall of 2004, we made a visit to one of the lowest income and most mobile parts of the Monterrey metropolitan area, the municipio called Juarez. And there, in a community that was full of people from all over Mexico, there was also a young girl who we call Rosa, who had been born in rural San Luis Potosí, had moved at age 2 with her parents to Texas, had attended 4 different school systems in Texas as the family moved around for varying reasons. All of her younger siblings, and there were 4 of them, had been born in the US. Again, Rosa was not a US citizen because she was born to Mexico parents, even though she'd spent time in the US, but her younger siblings all were. And then the father had engaged in a sufficiently serious drug infraction that he had been deported and the family followed. I should also say it was a sufficiently minor infraction that he was deported, not incarcerated. But the family unexpectedly suddenly found itself back in Mexico with very limited resources, living in a marginal community. And I remember quite distinctly, this is why I'm telling you the story 18 years later, I remember quite distinctly when we approached the school asking if we could pilot our instrument. They said, oh, sure, but you won't find any students with transnational experience here. But yeah, you can try your interview. In the very first classroom we went to, we asked at the front of the classroom, has any student here ever lived in the United States and gone to school there? And say 24 children all pointed their fingers at this poor young student named Rosa. And Rosa was more than a little bit flummoxed. At any rate, we then got to interview her, and she said we could interview her if we would do the interview entirely in English. And my colleague, who was a stronger Spanish speaker, sort of deferred to me as the stronger English speaker. Rosa was failing all of her classes except for art, PE, and English. In fact, her English teacher in secundaria in Mexico, you start doing English as a foreign language. Her English teacher would routinely appeal to Rosa to help with English language pronunciations. There's a whole different tangent that we could go on about the experience of transnational students in Mexico and English teachers. And sometimes they get along swimmingly and there's wonderful relationships and the students are seen as resources. Other times there is a sort of contest where the teacher feels threatened by the student's English proficiency and it becomes more difficult. At any rate, I want to set up these two overlapping origin stories because I want to suggest that we looked in Georgia and found students who'd previously been in Mexico, and in some cases we're going to return to Mexico. Then we go to Mexico and we find students who've previously been in the US, and at least some of them tell us that they sure hope they can go back to the US. So we have students who are prospectively of two countries, but risk instead being between two countries. So let me now go to the sort of the five larger frames, and I don't need to get terribly pedantic with these. But the first is the UN Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 points out that, or claims, insists that schooling is a right. And to me, as an anthropologist, I find it kind of curious for, a million years, our species, or 250,000 years, however long you think Homo sapiens has wandered the planet. We have raised young, we have educated young, but we haven't used school as the instrument for that until, the last couple hundred years. And in terms of the bulk of the childhood population getting that, that's within the last 100 years that most of the planet has found itself at school. But 1948, partly codifying that, the UN Declaration of Human Rights says everybody has a right to school. Moreover, that schooling needs to be directed towards their full development of personality, respect for human rights, respect for each other, and so forth. I should, as an aside here, point out that I teach at UNL both multicultural education and a course called School and Society, both of which are part of our teacher education pathway. And one of the storylines that emerges in both of those classes is the acknowledgement that, I'm training teachers. I know that school can be good. School can be transcendent. School is prospectively life-changing in a favorable sense. But it's also the case that school sometimes isn't good. School sometimes segments. It sometimes hurts. It sometimes blocks opportunity rather than building it. So I bring up these notions here, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, here Mexico's Constitution, and then a little bit of a further explanation about how the US insists by law on schooling. I bring all of these up to suggest that they raise the possibility that societies want the next generation to receive this formal support organized into institutions called schools, placing students in places called classrooms, led by teachers, learning also from peers and curricula. That new construct is profound at this point, but it's not always good. What I want to clarify here is, in addition to whatever the UN might say, Mexico says that all of its children are guaranteed a right to a free education. That goes back to the 1917 Constitution written in Mexico's revolution. More recently, the 2013 education reform under Mexico's previous president insisted that not only would the education be free, it would be high quality. And while the reform inaugurated by the Peña Nieto is certainly controversial and incomplete, the notion of free and quality is something that I want all of us to sort of hold on to as we continue through this presentation. I also want to point out that I'll sometimes ask my undergraduates, what does the US Constitution say about schooling? And perhaps because they're shy or perhaps because they don't know the why of the question, they stay silent. And then after about a 15-second pause, I will be like, correct, because nobody has said anything. The US Constitution says nothing about schooling. However, in 1954, the US Supreme Court, acknowledging that schooling had become a popular phenomenon in every state in the country. States were offering public schooling everywhere in the United States. The Supreme Court said that if states were going to offer schooling, then federal civil rights protections epitomized in the 14th Amendment needed to apply, the promise of equal schooling. And in particular, the 14th Amendment was evoked, and the 14th Amendment promises all persons, it doesn't say citizens, it promises all persons with equal protection under the law. And so as case law post Brown v. Board, for example, the Plyler v. Doe case in 1982 that looks at students who don't have social security numbers, who may not have documentation, they are promised an education in part because the 14th Amendment promises equal protection under the law to all persons. And if age mates are going to school, then these students too get to go to school. Different point, but these all come together. Constructivist learning theory. I don't want to do a whole grad seminar in about 45 seconds, but the key points here are we make sense as human beings, we make sense of new information using what we already know. That means if we go to school in Mexico, after previously having been in school in California, we use what we learned in California to make sense of school in Mexico. Prospectively, that's a great thing. However, if habits in Mexican and California classrooms, raise a hand, enthusiastically offer an answer, get praised by a teacher for your eagerness, if those play differently in a Mexican classroom, the student thinking, I want to be understood as a good student, I want to raise my hand, I want to be enthusiastic, if that's going to be responded to differently in a Mexican classroom, and it might, norms and sort of codes of conduct vary a little bit, that student is going to sort of misuse or not understand from their experience and background what it is that instead that they're supposed to be doing in Mexico. So if we're trying in the school that is receiving kids who have experienced someplace else, one of our tasks is to help students access their background knowledge and then understand how that background knowledge applies or perhaps needs to be transformed to the new learning task. The other thing that's worth noting that comes out of Vygotsky and social psychology is this notion that the role of teachers and the role of schooling is in part to push kids to take on stuff that on their own, absent support, they might not get to or might not get to efficiently. And so we have this notion of a zone of proximal development where a student can achieve something with somebody else's support. But one of the key conditions of zone of proximal development learning is a sense of safety or trust. And that gives us a window to sort of wonder or question, is the curriculum that a child is encountering understood as safe or trustworthy? And if it's incomprehensible, perhaps it's also feared. Are the peers understood as safe or trustworthy? Or is a child going to sort of retreat and be very shy and nervous because they're not sure what the reception is by peers? And for that matter, is the teacher welcoming, encouraging, inclusive, or is the teacher feared or viewed suspiciously for grounded or unfair reasons, right? But one of the tasks, according to constructivist learning theory, when we're talking about transnational students, one of the tasks has to be, how do we build trust? Drawing from yet another range of ideas here, and again, I'm putting 35 years worth of sort of thinking together in a 35-minute talk. Anthropology, cultural anthropology in particular, often talks about emics and edicts. It also often uses the word ontology. Ontology refers to the study of the nature of reality or realities. Ontological variation means that there are different realities. A quick way to illustrate that, if we can imagine ourselves, given that Halloween is coming, if we can imagine ourselves in 1692 Salem, per an emic sensibility at that time, witches were real. Witches were real, witches needed to be feared, witches needed to be put on trial, and this concept of witches was so convincing that people were killed. They were found guilty and killed, right? The Salem witch trials, right? So it's not, were witches real in some kind of, let's sit back and talk objectively as to whether there really were witches there or not. Per the sensibility, the meaning making engaged in by the folks who lived there, the emic reality, it was real. So one of the things that anthropologists will sometimes do is juxtapose, how does the group that we're studying, how do they make sense of things? And then can we, from a more analytical standpoint, offer a sort of different take on the same thing? But in noting this idea called ontological variation, is it possible that some people's understanding of certain topics from a cultural standpoint varies from other people's understandings? So if a student is eager to please, but they have changed environments that they're going to school in, are their understandings of what constitutes pleasing behavior going to be successful in the new environment or not? They have learned and made meaning in one system, and that the sort of operational realities of the people in the new system may or may not closely match. So we set up a scenario where different understandings of realities can explain a challenge. This is the anthropological complement to the social psychology of the previous slide. Is it possible that that's where things might break down? And students can get flummoxed. And it may well be the case that the teachers, absent attention to sort of what's going on or why, understand a child as shy rather than confused, understand a child as slow rather than not having their background knowledge accessed by the teacher. So all kinds of things can go on, but I want to sort of put ontological variation and emic and etic on the table. The fourth of 5 dynamics that I want to talk about here is and all of these could be lectures unto themselves, and I realize I'm racing through a lot. But this fourth one is called transnationalism from below. It's an idea that comes out of late 1990s sociology. Its authors were primarily Michael Peter Smith and Luis Guarnizo. And in a nutshell, it's the claim that extended families will make calculations sort of communally, what is in the sort of larger interest of our extended network. And the calculation is not, this is transnationalism from below, the calculation is not how do we maximize opportunity, it's instead how do we minimize risk. And let's say that traditionally a family has lived in a rural community in Mexico and engaged in subsistence farming. But it turns out that subsistence farming can't compete with large-scale farm production. It turns out that the area, partly because of climate change, is beginning to suffer from drought in ways that the subsistence farmer sort of can't handle. One of the sensible things to do is to have some portion of that family, say, move to Los Angeles, and maybe the family has enough money to sort of sponsor the move to Los Angeles, and then the person in Los Angeles has a familial obligation back to send remittances to rural Zacatecas. But it's not automatic that the person who's moved to Los Angeles is immediately going to do well. And it may well be that the family in Zacatecas can continue to send money to support the establishment of the family member. Eventually, once the sort of new person, the family member gets established in the new place, and some of the family remains in the old place, you increase the likelihood that you're buffeted from economic shock, because the likelihood that the challenges that go with subsistence farming, they're not likely to be the same as the challenges that go with succeeding in the economy of Los Angeles. So those sort of, the fact that those aren't articulated with each other reduces the family's risk. Why do I bring that up? I bring that up in part because it becomes a rationale for enduring transnationalism. The task isn't, we want to move from Mexico and permanently live in the United States, nor is the task, we want to leave the United States and permanently live in Mexico. Instead, the task is, we want to have people on both sides of the borders, because there's ways that connected with people on the other side helps us diminish our risk. And there's the ways that having some of us stay here, whatever side here is, helps us diminish risk. And so you have families that become binational, and you have the circulation of family members between two countries. This arrangement breaks down, by the way, if the family can't stay in contact. And obviously some social media, FaceTime, WhatsApp, things like that assist with communication. But rituals like getting together at Christmas or seeing each other in person are important for the ongoing sort of integrity of this multi-location system. You sort of reconnect and renew and then redisperse. Okay. Why else does transnationalism from below matter? Let me again reference some of the research that we've talked about. In this case, I'm thinking of a 2011, well, actually a 2018 piece as well that we write this up. A piece in 2018 called Parenting from Afar. we talk about a brother and sister that we encountered visiting schools in Puebla, Mexico. Both of the kids had been born in Chicago. Both of the parents of these kids were still in Chicago, and these students were living with their grandparents. The parents had made a decision, based on what the kids told us, the parents had made a decision that it was safer for their children not to stay in Chicago, but instead to return or to move to Mexico. The kids had never been there, but to move to Mexico with the parents staying in Chicago. The parents could send remittances. But as ICE raids grew, first under the end of the George W. Bush administration, and then continued under Obama, and certainly ICE raids continued under Trump as well, as the calculation went, if it became more and more obvious, or something that needed to be worried about, were parents at risk of being detained because of a workplace raid, and if they were detained, were their kids in jeopardy, because who was going to look out for them? If the family had to make a calculation like that, then it made sense for the children to be with the grandparents, where the grandparents could watch out for their safety, even though the kids, as US citizens, absolutely had a right to stay in Chicago. But the parents and the family writ large, the extended family, were making calculations that we can characterize as transnationalism from below. The challenge for schools in Puebla, Mexico, negotiating kids whose previous school experience had been in Chicago, Illinois, that challenge existed because of the sociological dynamic called transnationalism from below that was intended to reduce economic risk. A fifth point, and this is in some sense the punchline. I'm not standing in front of you as, or sitting in front of you as a demographer, but it's important that we grasp that there's an awful lot of kids we're talking about. The total population, K-12 in the state I live in, Nebraska, is about 230,000 kids. I think I'm doing that right. Maybe it's 320. I'm now getting the 2 and 3 back confused. At any rate, imagine a population 3 or 4 times the size of all the kids that go to school in Nebraska, as instead constituting a student population, either in Mexico but born in the US, or in the US but born in Mexico, a student population that was living outside of their countries of birth and going to school outside of their countries of birth. So back to this notion of transnational students, paying attention to them, we have roughly 1 million minors under age 18 who either live in the US but were born in Mexico, or live in Mexico but were born in the US. There is a substantially higher number living both in the US or Mexico, and in this case, the US is a bigger portion of this, a substantially higher number where one or both of the parents were born in a different country. And that's where you can get a dynamic like what we talked about with Mexico-born parents, likely without documentation, deciding to send their US-born kids back to the grandparents in Puebla. At any rate, you may have as many as 5 million kids in US and Mexican households where the prospect of relocation is higher because of a continued parent tie to the other country. One of the things that we've documented at length and quite commonly, we'll ask kids questions, why did you come back? And the explanations vary. Sometimes the family literally raised the nest egg that had been the reason for migration to the US, and the amount of money saved carefully and scrupulously meant that the whole family could move/return to Mexico to start a family business. We also had cases of a divorce, and the splitting up of a household meant that a single parent and kids moved to Mexico to be nearer to an extended family support network, given that the nuclear family network had fractured. We had folks who were moving because grandparents, as they got older, needed to be cared for. So a parent returning in a kind of filial responsibility brought kids in tow. At any rate, we would argue, my fellow researchers and I, that the likelihood of transnational mobility is higher for families that have mixed status, or families that have multiple nations represented in terms of parent birthplace and where the extended families are. One of the things that hides from demographers is the population, and I made an earlier reference to the 0.5 generation, but the population that is born in a country, leaves that country and goes to school someplace else, and then comes back to the original country. So a child born in Mexico, like Cynthia, a child born in Mexico like Rosa, who I mentioned earlier, both cases born in Mexico, moved as infants or toddlers to the US, started their schooling in the US, returned to Mexico. One of the things that the Mexican public school system does is keep data on children's birthplace. That's an interesting data source to find out if kids have been transnationally mobile, but both Cynthia and Rosa in this example would be invisible in terms of birthplace. Their transnationalism would be invisible because they were born in Mexico and we found them in Mexico. It was only the serendipity of asking if anybody had experience at the front of their classroom in the US and these kids identifying themselves that allowed that sort of fact to be captured. In work that I've done with Victor Zuniga, Juan Sanchez, previously alluded to in the acknowledgements, work in the states in Mexico of Nuevo León, Zacatecas, Puebla, Jalisco, and Morelos, we found that we made a ratio of sort of US-born kids who we found in Mexico, some of whom had US school experience, some had been born in the US but never gone to school there. We found that a ratio of about 41 to 100 that the number of people who've been born in Mexico, gone to the US and gone back to Mexico. So we guesstimated, because this is a lot of extrapolation off of a relatively small n, we guesstimated that there were probably 300,000 or 400,000 students in Mexican schools who were born in Mexico, had spent some time in the US, and then were back in Mexico. Similarly, you can have a US to Mexico to US population as well. I want to make two other demographic points. One is to show off a map. This comes from a demographer named Claudia Masferrer and her colleagues. Basically what you can see here, and I don't know if you all can see you cannot, my cursor moving, but if you know a map of Mexico, that dark navy in the sort of top left is Baja California. There's over 80,000 minors in 2015 in Baja California who'd been born in the US. You cut across the US-Mexican border heading east. In Sonora, per coloration, there were 30,000 kids in Sonora, in Sonora, not necessarily enrolled in schools, although a lot of them would have been, who'd been born in the US. You continue across to Chihuahua, you get a deeper blue. You can see that there's between 40 and 50,000, or that actually may be a stronger blue. It may be the 50 to 60,000 color. At any rate, you continue on, you get to Coahuila, the blue is lighter. We're talking maybe 20,000. Nuevo León, talking maybe 20,000. Tamaulipas, again, following the border, looks a little darker, 30,000, maybe 40,000. But you also find further south in Mexico, like there's Jalisco, also in a deeper blue. There's Michoacan, also in a deeper blue. There are some long-time sending locations from Mexico to the US that had a fair amount of US-born kids back in Mexico, or in Mexico, back with their parents. So I want to sort of bring up the idea, because it'll matter, that when we talk about these transnational populations, in Mexico, they are not evenly distributed. And it also is the case, as we'll talk about. I don't have as neat and clean a map of the US because the maps that I was able to find were older. But not surprisingly, and I'll turn to the next slide to sort of make these points. According to an article published by the Migration Policy Institute, and here's the citation at the bottom of this, in 2019, so this was done by a sample, not by the census, although the census had its own problems in 2020. There were an estimated 10,932,000 Mexican-born people. So I'm not talking Mexican heritage, I'm talking about Mexican birthplace. There were 10.9 million Mexican-born people living in the US, accounting for 97% of Mexico's extranjero population. That is, Mexico-born people living outside of Mexico. So there's a tiny population in Canada, there's a tiny population in Germany, handful of other places, but 97% of Mexicans who don't live in Mexico live in the US. That was actually a decline. There'd been a little over 11 million in 2010. So one of the things that's intriguing, we're living in a moment where the direction arrow, the flow of migrants across borders, despite political rhetoric at the current moment, there is more movement from the US to Mexico than vice versa. Migration tends to be circular. It has been for a long time. You certainly have people moving from Mexico to the United States, likely at this very moment. But you also have folks moving from the US to Mexico, likely at this moment. We can read through a couple of other stats. Much of the Mexico-born population that's in the US has lived in the US more than 20 years. There's more than 500,000 registered DACA recipients who were born in Mexico. 36% of the Mexico-born population in the US is in California, 22% in Texas, 6% in Illinois, 5% in Arizona. Then another 13% is collectively accounted for Florida, Georgia, Washington, North Carolina, Colorado, Nevada. Again, the point is these Mexico-born populations may have particular sites of concentration, but they're all over the country too. And so the places and the wheres of which schools and school districts are negotiating this is high. Only 4% of the Mexico-born population in the United States is minors. That means that there has been much less migration recently with children who are Mexico-born, less than there was a decade ago. But even that 4% means that you have 430,000 Mexico-born minors living in the US. Highly relevant to California. There are 10 metropolitan statistical areas. So Los Angeles, Long Beach, and I'm trying to think of the other community that's named in that is over 10%. Riverside, San Bernardino, and I'm trying to think, there's a third community there as another statistical area, and then San Diego, and I'm going to also blank on the additional names of communities that are part of that metropolitan statistic area. But the important point is Southern California, so Los Angeles Basin, Inland Empire, and San Diego all have a greater than 10% of the total population in those areas was actually born in Mexico. It's just demographics here to give you scale. So what does this all mean? And I'm literally going to try to pull this all together on this final slide. And I realize that I'm throwing a whole bunch of different ideas at you at once. These kids, and we're talking about a lot of them, may not need the same things from school as some of their peers. I think we can make an argument that kids who are transnationally mobile probably need to be bilingual. I'm not sure all kids need to be bilingual. And if all kids do need to be bilingual, I'm not sure it's English and Spanish. But for these kids between the US and Mexico, they do need to be bilingual, and it does need to be English and Spanish because those are the dominant languages of the two geographies they're going to negotiate. I want to suggest to you, I'm obviously not going to sit in front of you and say the standards movement is a bad idea. Standards are important. The high academic expectations that we've articulated in content area after content area in the United States in the last 30 years is a useful guide to important things for kids to learn. However, the standards movement has been fraught or problematic in one important way. It has allowed us to worry about what all kids need instead of subpopulations these kids need, right? And I'm going to propose that students who are moving between the US and Mexico in an enduring fashion need differently from school, need additionally from school than just what the standards, Mexico content standards and US content standards specify. These kids, when they move, and the millions of them that move, when they move, bring knowledge useful for negotiating somewhere else. Luis Moll, Norma Gonzalez, Carlos Vélez Ibáñez, a number of other scholars have sort of famously coined the phrase, funds of knowledge. If we understand these transnational students as bringing wisdom, wherewithal, a sensibility about how to negotiate someplace else, if we see what they know as assets, we treat them in our classrooms differently than if we view them as not knowing what it is that we wish they'd knew already, right? So there's a little bit of a educational choice. You can view kids in deficit terms, which is destructive to those kids and challenging to the educational environment, or you have the complex task of figuring out what are the assets and how to incorporate those. So as a sort of point of sympathy, I think the educational task is maybe more complicated and harder than we thought of it before, but absolutely we need to hear, think, and understand what assets kids are bringing with them. It struck me as intriguing when I was working in Monterrey in Nuevo León, Mexico. The State Department of Education in Nuevo León has long prioritized Mexico. Monterrey in particular is going to be economically competitive the more kids who learn English and come to adulthood as bilingual people. There was an emphasis, and continues to be an emphasis, on mastering cutting edge technology. And it occurred to me that you have these students coming. One difference between schooling in the US and Mexico is the abundance of technological apparatus, computers, laptops, but also tablets. Just the sort of routine encounter with technology in US classrooms is high. You have kids coming to Mexico already knowing how to do a whole bunch of stuff, and then they encounter classrooms where there's less opportunity to continue to develop that. So returning to this point, they bring assets. Wouldn't it be interesting if education systems could pivot to count what kids know, and they learned it perhaps out of order? They learned it in a different way than the system expected, but they learned it, they bring it, and it's a shame if we skip it. More than a shame, actually. It's also worth acknowledging that while we don't know for sure what the future will bring, we nonetheless have accepted as educators this challenge of sort of getting kids ready for it. And I do think it's fair to say that we know that the future will include bridging borders. We know that the future will require more intercultural and international cooperation and adaptability. Moreover, we know that these are things that these transnational kids have sort of by default had to figure out. So each of these are skills and orientations that transnational students can have in abundance. We've just got to figure out how to count it. An alternative title I had for this talk, and I look back at my email exchange with Dr. Hernandez-Leon for this, the alternative title was "We Might Move: The Complex Work of Educating Children Who Attend School in Mexico and the United States." So not either or, but and. And this challenge, we might move, it's hard as a US-based fourth grade teacher to think some of the kids in my enrollment might be in Mexico in fifth grade. It's likely true, but we don't know which ones. We don't know why. It may be that the move doesn't happen until seventh grade. It may be that the move doesn't happen until 10th grade. But we know that some of the kids, because of the patterns that we've documented for the last 30 years, we know some of the kids will sometime be someplace else. And so we have to ask ourselves, is my fourth grade classroom readying kids for fifth grade at this school, fifth grade in this district, fifth grade in this state, but also fifth grade someplace else? And you can ask that question by content area. Is my health class getting ready for the next health class? Is my math class getting ready for the next math class? We can do this by grade level. We can do this a number of different ways, but the prospect of students in your current enrollment perhaps moving in the future is an intriguing challenge because we don't know which ones they are. It's also the case, and this is a little bit more tangible because at least in this case we can ask, that we have kids in our enrollment who have just moved, and we may not know that they've just moved. And just moved might mean they came 2 weeks ago, just before the school year started. It might mean that they came 18 months ago, but they're still negotiating things about this place that are unfamiliar or things about that place that they remember and miss, right? So this, we might move, we might be mobile, I think is a really sort of powerful lens to try to hold on to. As a final point, and then the remaining 3 slides, I'm just going to scroll through so that you can see some resources. But as a final point as sort of the talk, if you will, how does assessment, planning, and curriculum all look different if we consider that the kids in front of us might be adjusting from a move and or needing to get ready for a future one? Just so you see what's here, and the slide deck, I think, can be made available to you. Here's some resources. We've published, I don't know, 25, 30 different articles and book chapters and so forth off of this work. Here's 4 of them. Here's 4 more. Here's 4 more. So here's 12 of the 30. Some of it's in English, some of it's in Spanish. All of it is available through a URL. So FYI, that all exists. I appreciate everybody's attention. Like I acknowledged at the beginning, it's a little bit surreal, sort of seeing an audience of literally 3 people, which is literally the captions on their Zoom screen. They're frozen. So it's maybe I should practice being a radio announcer, because I feel a little bit like I'm speaking into a microphone, but not quite sure to whom. But I appreciate your attention. Obviously, this is a topic area that has intrigued me for decades. And if we want our schools to accomplish what we hope they can, then we need to pay attention to this. And when I say we want our schools, our in this case means in Mexico, our in this case means in the US, our in this case means in California, our in this case means in Los Angeles. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ted, for this wonderful presentation and for sharing so much knowledge, and really highlighting the abundance of these transnational students, that sometimes it's easy to put labels to the students. And as you mentioned in your presentation, they get put in this track that it can completely changes the outcome, and not only in academic wise, but in their life.
Sure.
So the repercussions of those labels can, and sometimes we don't think everything that can happen with just that label that gets put on it on the students. So muchas gracias, thank you. So now we have a few minutes for I just want to let you know that we do have a group audience here. Good. So you were not just speaking to yourself, like there was we had a really diverse group of audience here, and we and for those of you that are here, this is a good time for you to write your questions in the Q&A box, and so Ted can address them.
Do you want me to end the slideshow? Do I then get to actually see some people? Okay.
Yeah, you can. What I'm going to do, so I'm going to be compiling all the resources that get shared by the speakers, and they're going to be available on our website for educators, for teachers to be able to consult anytime they wish. So, so comments, questions, you can put them in the Q&A box or in the chat. Preguntas, comentarios.
I do see in the chat there's an ongoing call for donations.
Yes, that's the one that Professor Hernandez was mentioning at the beginning of the talk. So I have some comments here that I would like to read aloud. So people are saying thank you for your talk, and from Karen Einstein, and then Jamie Woodwin White. And I think he just deleted it or removed it.
I think I typed my answer and that deleted it. That's interesting to know.
Oh,
if I type an answer, the question goes away.
So so I wasn't able to read it. I was being so I don't know if you
he said he was a quasi demographer and that he appreciated the blending of these perspectives, and I thought that was quite kind. So I said thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And then we have here a question from teacher Maria Salazar. She's a high school teacher. And this very interesting information. As a high school teacher, I don't always know when a student is moving to Mexico or coming back. How do I have this conversation with my students?
So there's two answers. One is, I don't think you'll ever always know. Some kids won't know it. Some kids won't disclose it, even if they do know it. Sometimes relocation decisions are not premeditated. They're quite sudden, related to family trauma. We've written about a case of a middle school girl whose father was deported, and news was shared with the middle school counselor of the family making a decision that they were going to reunite with the father a week hence. So there was sort of a week to get things together, and cobbling together things like transcripts and brainstorm a little bit about which school to enroll in if the kids moved, US-born kids moved to Mexico, to a place that the kids had never been. There was also the sort of psychological baggage of that sudden, movement, unanticipated movement, scary movement. I'm going to a place I've never been to. And I remember being in this very sort of surreal role of trying to better understand what a middle schooler was about to negotiate, and saying, you've never met your grandmother before except on FaceTime. Isn't it exciting that you're going to get to meet her? And feeling like her whole world had been turned upside down, and I was trying to come up with a silver lining. I'd like to think that comments like that help. It acknowledges that circumstances can be, particularly in the immediate moment, quite painful or scary. So sometimes you will get a little bit of a heads up, and the heads up may not be that long. I think of some students that we met in Morelos where the mother had made a decision. The kids were intentionally being raised binationally, and she worried that her kids were going to miss the chance to sort of know their Mexican heritage. So it was a premeditated year in Mexico where the father stayed in the Bay Area. They got together on school breaks and vacations to sort of attend to family unity. But the idea was they would live with the mother and extended family for a year to sort of know both sides. A scenario like that, it's clear you would know about that ahead of time. But I think I guess a further point, and I'm saying this a little bit in conjecture, I think you want your kids, and it's quite possible they already do. So I don't know you, so I don't mean to say you don't act this way already. But I think it's important for you to express that you care about your kids' well-being, whether it continues to be in your classroom or classrooms grades above you in that same school building, or if they go someplace else, and that your care for them as human beings, as students, but as human beings, extends to wanting them to be successful wherever. And if their life is likely to be binational or transnational, be excited about that as an opportunity. I mean, I do feel, and I don't mean this as cynically as it'll sound, I do feel a little bit like we're spin doctors, and we can help make a daunting prospect seem like an exciting one. And that orientation may help a little bit a child who's nervous persist, but this is going to be good. It's going to be hard at the beginning, but this is going to be good. And that's a better angle, if you will, than fear that gets exacerbated rather than relieved a little bit. We don't want to be disingenuous with students, but I think we can help them sort of identify some of the things about a prospective move that could be exciting. Hopefully that speaks to some of the sort of thoughts and concern. Thanks.
And it's kind of like a follow-up to this question. In your research, have you encountered like resistance on behalf of like the parents or the students, resistance in getting help from the teachers, from the schools? So like, what is that context? Like,
sure. I don't know if resistance is the right word, or more from our experience doing work at schools. I don't know how we would have documented resistance. So if a parent was skeptical of sharing information like that with the school, then where we were gathering information, we would never have found that out, right? So it's plausible that there would be a skepticism of school. One of the things, and this will seem a little bit like a tangent, but a different part of my research has looked at school district responses to ICE raids in the United States. And one of the things that was striking in, there was a series of ICE raids on the idea of the Virgin of Guadalupe, December 12, 2006. And schools sort of emerge as the sort of hub of information communication and sanctuary. And here in Nebraska, where I live, in O'Neill, there was a raid about 4 years ago, just before the pandemic. And the school, having learned lessons from previous raids elsewhere in the state, it was just before the school year started, but after the teachers had gone back, they announced that the school would be a sanctuary, and anybody who was confused or worried or wasn't sure what was going to go on, they would be welcome at the school. Come, and we'll try to keep you informed. And very few parents came. And I think one of the ways America changed between 2006 and 2018, perhaps because of ICE enforcement, because of rhetoric that was anti-immigrant, schools were not as consistently understood as safe places, or places where you would disclose why you might be worried. So if there had been an ICE raid and you wanted further information, was that saying something about your adult status that could put you or your household in jeopardy? So you wouldn't go to the school, even though the school was saying that it was safe. To me, that's a really sort of frustrating and damning critique of, sort of recent politics around migration and immigration in the US. But I, as a scholar based in the Midwest, can't change that in any kind of tangible or important way. But I do want to raise it up as a concerning dynamic, but one that I suspect could be in play. And the word resistance, yes, parents might resist being in a scenario where their documentation status might be disclosed, where they might come across as in ways that they don't want to be understood. And documentation status isn't the only sort of prospectively private information that somebody wouldn't want known. But that strikes me as one, and one that would be salient in a number of cases.
Thank you so much for responding to that.
Yeah, so to this question that I'm seeing, or do you want to read it? I'm sorry, Veronica, I'm getting all eager.
I'm not sure, like, if we were reading the same question. There's a comment saying, thank you for your work and your presentation. And there's a follow-up questions that said, I wonder if Mexico Secretaría de Educación and let's say LAUSD would collaborate to create a curriculum to meet the special needs of transnational students.
There have been some efforts, and Patricia Gandara, who's recently retired from UCLA, has been one of its sort of leaders. But there has been, under a framing called Los Alumnos que Compartimos, the students that we share, there have been efforts, and I've blurred my background, but I can do a sort of show and tell, the students we share. That references some efforts to more actively collaborate. It is worth noting that Mexico from 2006 to 2012 operated a program called Escuelas Sin Fronteras. Actually, two of the publications that are in the list that I shared as part of my PowerPoint, although I scrolled through them awfully fast, come out of that. One is a guide for Mexican teachers called Alumnos Transnacionales, Escuelas Mexicanas Frente a la Globalización. So transnational students, Mexican schools encountering or confronting globalization. And that book and then a teacher's guide were intended to help Mexican teachers better understand some of the challenges and possibility that came with the transnational movement of students. I don't know that we've ever gotten as concrete and specific as let's fully reconcile curricula. One of the things that Mexico's education reform in 2013 argued for is more autonomy for Mexican teachers in terms of lesson design, which is a disappearing but longstanding norm in US schools. So there clearly should and could be more communication. I made a reference to a program that doesn't exist anymore. I should also name one that does, called PROBEM, the Programa Binacional de Educación Migrante. That is a Mexican program that I think operates in about 22 of Mexico's states, so not everywhere. I don't think it exists in Tabasco, for example, or some of the places with real low migration. But the PROBEM office in Tijuana, I earlier alluded to Yara Amparo Lopez, a longtime collaborator with me and with our team. She is the coordinator of PROBEM and has really, her work in Tijuana, another guy named Javier Gonzalez in Mexicali have really done some pioneering work trying to help Mexican teachers be ready for this transnationalism. So yes, there is conversation about sort of curriculum reconciliation. How do we count different pieces? But a full co-creation of curricula with very limited exception hasn't happened. I will say, and it's possible that this is available as a PDF online, the Escuelas Sin Fronteras initiative created a bunch of bilingual notebooks And depending on which side you started, it was you have the margin on the left. It started in English and you could work in Spanish. You flip it over again, the margin on the left, you start in Spanish and work through the notebook in English. It's sort of really interesting the way they printed it. But there are a handful of resources that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there's some I'm not aware of, that intentionally try to be relevant to an audience that is prospectively leaving Mexico, going to the US, or prospectively just come from the US back to Mexico or to Mexico. So, but that's paltry in the grand scheme of how much curricula is out there. Those are pretty minor forays, but the concept is in play.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. I don't know if there is anything else that you would like to add, Ted, before we close.
One note I had made in one of my slides, and I didn't get there. I got nervous and excited and worried that I wasn't going through too much. The word immigration and the word immigrant, neither of those are bad words, and I don't mean to claim otherwise, but they can be misleading words. When we say immigration in the US, you can conjure up images of the Statue of Liberty, of Ellis Island, but at the end of the day, it sort of sets up this idea of how do we help immigrants, benevolently intended, how do we help immigrants adjust to here? And one of the things that I've continued to ponder transnationalism from below as I ponder this sort of rising group that is both of Mexico and of the US. And if you say, but which one really? There isn't a right answer because it's not which one really, it's both. It's insistently both. We need to understand the sort of emergence of a population that shouldn't be understood as immigrant or emigrant, as, I am from there, but now I'm here, as if that's going to be an enduring status. It is being a sojourner or being of two is sort of a new possible reality. And excitingly, the people who are really good at it bring an awful lot to the table. So we shouldn't lament that, we should be excited about it. But immigrant and immigration as phrases sort of just steer us away a little bit from that. So just one last sort of chance to pontificate about terminology. There it is.